Now, the conflict in Ukraine continues to spark concerns of a global war. Russia targeted a military base 15 kilometers from the Polish border. Poland is a NATO member, and if the fighting crosses the border, the alliance may have no choice but to get involved. Or will they? Let's explore that prospect. We're joined by Brooks Spector, associate editor at Daily Maverick and a retired American diplomat. Brooks, good to see you. Do you perceive that Vladimir Putin will take it that far?
Well, I certainly hope not, and I think most people share that view. Nevertheless, the missile or the bomb strike, it's not quite clear what it was, cruise missile perhaps, was, if nothing else, a cautionary note. Hopefully it was not intended to be a temptation or a confrontation with NATO forces, but it could just easily have gone awry and hit Poland. I mean, remember, something traveling that fast can easily move a little further than would have been intended. And as you correctly point out, the NATO allies and President Joe Biden from the United States have basically said there cannot be any attacks on NATO nations, properly speaking. That would be a provocation beyond everything we have seen up until this point. Turn your attention to what's happening in Ukraine itself, of course, and the Russian onslaught continues. In the military terms, it continues slowly and not particularly overwhelming in human terms, as buildings, as apartment blocks, as hospitals, schools, etc., get destroyed, as the scale of the refugee crisis, 2.5 million people very quickly, is the human cost of this one is extraordinary in just 2 weeks' time. And the fact that the Ukrainian government has demonstrated absolutely no interest in surrendering means that the Russians are going to have to conquer the country and then hold it, which is a whole lot more complicated than simply winning a military victory on the ground.
When you say complicated, what do you mean?
Well, when I say complicated in the sense of the NATO relationship, or complicated in the sense of the military situation in Ukraine? I think we used the word twice. Which one do you want to tackle?
The NATO relationship. Okay.
Let's say, for the sake of argument, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, but let's just say it does. Let's say that an airstrike hits a target in Poland or Romania, both NATO nations bordering on Ukraine. And let's say that there are casualties in that airstrike as a result. And let's say further, it wasn't a military target, but was in fact clearly civilian territory. The NATO response must come back as more than simply, no, that was a bad thing you did. There would have to be some sort of response, proportionate, but what kind of proportionate is going to burn up the telephone lines for some hours until that can be sorted out. And there would have to be apologies and compensation from the Russians and so forth. That is the kind of complication. We don't want to slide automatically from an airstrike that kills people to a major military confrontation. That's what I mean by complicated.
And I guess I'm asking you that because there are some sectors of society that have a school of thought that says, well, this war is essentially between Russia and the West, because Russia sees, Ukraine as a proxy for the West. The president of Ukraine has subsequently asked for a no-fly zone. Firstly, what is that, and of what significance would that be?
Well, first of all, I would disabuse you and your viewers that this is primarily a confrontation between NATO and Russia. In fact, there are no NATO forces engaged whatsoever, and there have been some fairly clear indications that there will be no NATO forces in Ukraine at all. It's hard to have a confrontation if you only have one side engaged in hostilities. A no-fly zone, however, becomes an entirely different matter. What it means, in effect, is that you use your air superiority to prohibit the other side from making use of the air for military activities. In other words, they would have to fly patrols over Ukraine to prevent Russian jets from using the airspace. That, of course, almost guarantees that there would be confrontations, and that the Russians, among other people, might well see that as an act of war as well. And so I think the argument that there will not be a no-fly zone imposed by the West is pretty strong and is unlikely to change unless there are other circumstances that become enormously more compelling. The accidental or deliberate airstrikes in Poland or Romania, as we were talking before. And to go back to the question of a confrontation between NATO and Russia, remember, this entire effort was a deliberate decision by the Russians to attack a nation which was not a member of NATO and which at this point, at that point at least, had no intentions of being on a war footing against anybody. I find it very hard to accept the logic that somehow this was a confrontation, unless you assume that the confrontation was taking place in the mind of Vladimir Putin. And that gets us into a very different conversation, doesn't it?
Completely. A conversation for a different day. Brooks Spector, always good to see you. Thank you for your time.